Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LocoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LocoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, welcome back to the Team LocoFit Roundtable. I'm Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LocoFit, and today's episode, we have a very special guest, one of my great friends, Bret Contreras.
Thanks for having me on, Laurin.
I'm so pumped for this, and I know everybody's going to be so excited. So you don't really need much of an introduction, but for people who don't know you maybe, who are listening, could you give us a short introduction on yourself?
I mean, I'm known as the glute guy. These days, my intro is different now because I used to be the glute guy. I was the only glute guy. Now there's a million. So now I say, like, I started this niche.
Yeah.
You know, I started this niche. I've been interested in the glutes since I was like 16. I had no butt. That's why I became so into glutes. I had the zero, back right into my legs, straight up and down. So I started trying to research that. I got my first book on glutes. And when I was 19, my cousin bought me this book. It was something like The Complete Guide to Butt and Leg Development. I still have it. It's still like in really good condition, by the way. And it's a cool looking book still, written in the 90s. And funny that many years later, 2 years ago, I released my first book on glutes, Glute Lab. But yeah, I got my PhD, CSCS with distinction, been personal training for 25 years, I guess. And I just love lifting weights. I love everything related to strength training and biomechanics and sports science. And I'm looking forward to sharing my knowledge with you. This one about hip thrusts, right?
Yes. So as everybody knows who might be listening or familiar with you, obviously hip thrusts are something that you popularized and have made. Like you said, you made the glute niche, right? Like a lot of people talk about training glutes, but really when people think of you, they do think of training glutes. And what better exercise than hip thrusts? Because there's a lot of still questions about it, and there's a lot of misconceptions. And one thing that I love about you is that, of course, you have your PhD and you have certifications and all of these things, but really you have been training people for a lot of years. Whereas a lot of people, and this is not taking anything away from them, but if they only have the book knowledge and not the training piece as well, it sometimes is like a mismatch. And I think that the best, of course, is always going to be the application as well as the science. So I think that is where a lot of this has come from for you, is training people for almost 25 years and seeing the changes, right? Like you would say that that's one of the most distinct. It's what's different about you.
It's funny you say that though, because these days I try to read a study a night, but I used to read 3. I used to know every researcher. I was, friends with all of them. I would go to conferences and meet them. I'm not as into the research anymore. I still love it. I wish I could conduct a million studies, but I don't have time to, I wish one of these days I'll hire a researcher to, work for me, and we can carry out studies and stuff, because there's so many things I'm curious about. But these days I start up my own, there's been 3 competitions so far. I started up my own. It's like powerlifting, but I call it strong lifting, and it's 6 lifts instead of 3. So just training my squad for this. And I'll say this with zero hesitation. I have the strongest natural female gym in the world, in the entire world. No one could hang with us, I don't think. And what's awesome is these girls didn't come to me freaks. I built them. I don't want to take credit. They worked their butts off, but I built them up, or I helped build them up. I hate when trainers do, I made this person. I didn't make them. They even now, like, I live in Vegas, I helped them from afar, and they've been able to gain so much strength. It's really amazing. But they're so strong. But we've figured out things about the hip thrust since training for these competitions, which started in October, because it's squats, bench, deadlifts, and then military press, chin-ups, and hip thrusts. And we've learned so much about training for all 6 lifts. Powerlifting is hard. Training for 3 lifts, training for 6 lifts is even harder. But I have one of my girls can hip thrust 800, one of them 700, about five of them 600. And I I still, like, if I haven't done hip thrusts in a long time, it's hard for me to hip thrust 600. Like, and I've got seven girls who can do it. They're so freaking strong. And this is, we're talking legit lockout, horizontal torso, neutral or posterior tilted pelvis. So I'm really proud about that. And uh, I totally agree with you. So many, you got all these, like, I think of all the body, like the best bodybuilders, the best powerlifters, they have a ton of knowledge, but the only thing they're typically lacking is like a scientific mindset. Like, they'll just tell you to do what worked for them because they're like, oh, I did this, and think of, we all kind of have that natural inclination. This worked for me, you should do this too, and it's going to work, do the exact same thing for you. If those people had a better scientific understanding, they'd be even more effective as educators. And then you have the researchers who have tend to have a lot of scientific knowledge, but no practical knowledge. And they end up saying really silly things sometimes because you're like, oh my God, that would never work in this atmosphere because
Yeah.
they have no practical knowledge. So that you're right. And I take pride in that. My whole life is, I'm not married. I don't have kids. I'm single, and so my days can be fully immersed with being in the gym or reading about strength training or doing podcasts like these. It's like my whole life is dedicated to strength training.
Yes, and eating, because that's every time we're together. All we do is work out, and eat. That's
Good
all
call.
we do. And the occasional drink too. But okay, so first of all, why hip thrusts? What are they, best for as far as like hypertrophy or strength or power, and anatomically, like what areas are we hitting most with hip thrusts?
Okay, well, first of all, it's all right. I'm going to take a long time to answer this, I think, because I'm going to go off in a few directions. But I always, back in the day, wanted an exercise like when you do like push-ups, you feel your pecs. Like when I would do curls, I'd feel my biceps. So when I was a 16-year-old kid, like wanting to train glutes, I try to, we didn't have the internet then. So I try to read the bodybuilding mags, and they did not talk about glutes. It was just leg day. They still don't. It's just leg day. And it's quads and hams. What are you training at, quads and hams? Males never say, I'm going to hit glutes. It's just this weird bodybuilding culture thing. It's always been that way since, like, Vince Gironda told people that you shouldn't have overdeveloped glutes, so you should do hack squats instead of back squats, because back squats will make your glutes too big. So it's just kind of a thing that's always perpetuated in bodybuilding. And then in bikini, it's all about glutes, which is kind of funny. So I always wanted an exercise where I felt my glutes, and I do squats, I do lunges. Back then I was a skinny kid. I folded over like an accordion. I didn't feel stuff that working that well. Uh, but hip thrust came along when I invented hip thrust. So people were doing bridges, they're doing glute bridges, but not barbell. No one. I've never seen anyone do a barbell hip thrust before me. I've asked to have people be like, my dad was doing that in the 60s. And I'm like, do you have a picture? I'd love to credit him, or anyone. If you ever find a video or a picture, I'd love to credit that person if they have their back on a bench and a barbell in their lap.
Yeah.
But I've never seen anything surface. And it's funny, I've gotten arguments with people. They're like, everyone was doing that in the 90s. And I'm like, then is there a picture? Is there a video? No, people didn't have camera phones back then. I'm like, but you can find pictures of every single exercise, except I can find pictures of literally, you name an exercise, I can find pictures of it in black and white. Just hip thrust, people just didn't take pictures of that. Weird. But anyway, that's what I love about the hip thrust. But here's the thing, there's no perfect exercise. It's like, I can't do barbell hip thrust that much right now because they hurt my knees. So I do Smith machine and Nautilus glute drive. Some people hate the Nautilus glute drive. Some people love it. Some people love the booty builder machines. Other people don't like it. Some people love barbell hip thrust. Some people like doing barbell glute bridges instead. Some people love single A hip thrust. Some people don't. That's the same for literally every like lower body exercise. So I happen to love hip thrust. Here's why. First of all, God, I wish I had my bullet points out. I'm going to forget something, but it's so easy to learn. Any beginner can master it pretty quickly. Like squats, deads take a lifetime to master, you're still 20 years in working on your form. hip thrusts, short learning curve, so they can be effective right off the bat. Second of all, and they're very stable. The more stable, the more glute activation. When you're off balance, the glutes don't fire as hard. Um, uh, Third of all, the knees stay bent. When the knees stay bent, you tend to get less hamstring activation because they're not at the brain's not going to fire them. They're not at an optimal length for force production. So it relies more on the glutes for hip extension torque. Fourth of all, there's more consistent tension on the hips throughout the range of motion, whereas the vertical loaded hip extension exercises tend to have a lot of torque at the bottom, torque requirements at the bottom, where you're in a stretch, but then when you're at the top, it tapers off. Hip thrusts are the hardest part for people are to lock it out, So I'm trying to think what else. So, and then it loads maximum, the maximum effort is at end range hip extension, where that's where you're going to get maximum tension at end range. And I've seen a lot of these pseudo glute experts these days come out. They just think you get maximum tension through the full range of motion, and you don't. The glutes are unique. And, I had to collaborate with like high level biomechanists to figure that out. Is every muscle is unique. The glutes tend to get maximum tension towards lockout. So that a lot of exercises don't load that region. Now, I do think you should always do a variety though. So we can talk about hip thrusts. Will hip thrusts alone maximize your glutes? I don't think so. I think you need, as in any muscle, I think you need a few different exercises. I think you need like a squat or lunge movement. I think you need a hip thrust type movement or something that hits end range, that targets end range, and then an abduction movement.
For sure. And I would say that a lot of people can get super obsessed with them, right? Like, oh my gosh, the only thing I can do for my glutes is hip thrust. And it's like, no, it's just like anything else. Like this is going to work them a little bit more, but we can do variations, especially if you're trying, let's say you're really trying to progress on your squat, right? Okay, well, you can do another hip thrust variation, but maybe it's going to be like a lighter, like a single leg or something like that, right? So it's a little bit different versus, okay, heavy squats and heavy hip thrust. But if you want to make, okay, hey, I want my hip thrust to go up, then your secondary lift might be a lighter goblet squat, something like that. So I think that there's so many variations, and I want to touch on that later because people forget about the variations. Like,
that's a good point. I want to interrupt you and elaborate on that before you ask the next question, because people think that, well, first of all, I just thought of another example. It doesn't hurt people. Like I just said that it hurts my knees, but that took a lot of time. And if I go lighter, it doesn't hurt my knees. But most people, I would say if I polled my followers, I did poll them once along, I think it was about a year and a half ago. And it was like deadlifts were up here, squats were here, and hip thrusts were down here for injuries. Like everyone hurts themselves with deadlifts, everyone. If you pull hard, you have to learn it the hard way. In my case, you have to learn it like 10 times. And then, squats, people hurt themselves with squats, but hip thrusts are such a safe lift in terms of what's actually happening, not what people speculate about, what really happens in the gym. And you know this if you're a trainer. Like my girls training for strong lifting, they tend to hurt themselves with deadlifts most often, then squats, then hip thrusts lastly. So it's a very safe lift. But what you touched upon is really important. For maximal muscular development, so it's funny, there's kind of like two things, two categories of, well, there's several, like there's people who want maximum strength as in powerlifting or now strong. I like strong lifting more than powerlifting. I think most people would, because if you train for powerlifting, I don't think it maximizes your physique. If you train for strong lifting, it does. There were things missing from it, but I need to get that popular. I invented it right during COVID time. So like then the worst time to we can't even have competitions yet. So, but that's training for maximum strength is one thing. Training for maximum muscle, like bodybuilding, is another thing. And then training for bikini or just some women, like a lot of Asian cultures, they don't want muscular legs. They want twig legs and more butt. They don't want quads. And it's hard because I try to tell them, like, you can do squats. You're not going to get giant quads right away. but they're afraid of that. But yeah, they really want twig legs, and it's hard for us to imagine that because we're like, why wouldn't you want some leg muscles? But
Yeah. That is such a common thing just in general with, oh, I don't want to train this because I'm going to get really, really muscular. And of course, there are going to be people who, you know, they train something very infrequently and they grow there very well, right? But most people along the bell curve of like normalcy do not, you know what I mean? And you have to really, really actively work hard to build size. But so with a hip thrust, and you've talked about this before, kind of like anatomically where you're going to hit things more. This is going to typically be a little bit more lower glute versus something like instead of obviously upper glute. You talked about a little bit. There's not really much quad. There's not a ton of hamstring. I would say that probably some angles, if you like the booty builder or like your original machine that kind of had like the slanted one, that might be a little bit more hamstring. But for the most part, it's going to be more lower glute, right?
no, it's actually the whole
Or,
like
okay. Well,
stand up right now and squeeze your glutes as hard as you can. Do it. Do it. Do it.
yeah, I'm doing it.
Glutes as hard as you can. Feel your upper. Even feel your
Yeah.
glute medius. You'll even feel your glute medius.
Hmm.
When you fire your glutes at lockout, the glute medius are still contracting.
Hmm.
The upper glute max and the lower glute max. There, so it works. That's the cool thing about the hip thrust too, is it works the whole glute. Whereas if you wanted to just work like the squats and lunges tend to bias the lower glutes more,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
abduction tends to bias the upper glutes more. So that's why I like I said, doing all three, like, and then it's also going to throw in a hinge there. But here's the deal. You do find some people, I would say like probably a third of people are like, I feel hip thrust in my quads. I feel hip thrust in my hamstrings. Two-thirds of people are like, oh, I feel all in my glutes. It's amazing. And then you do have some people. So that's the art of personal training. I can do things to tease out more. There's all these things I try. And it's funny I like when I do seminars. Remember when we used to do seminars back in the before COVID
I'm
days?
doing one in May. I'm super excited, so I can't wait.
I miss it so much.
I
But
know.
when I do seminars, like I'll say, who here has a hard time feeling their glutes in a hip thrust? And I'm like, okay, I like it as a challenge for me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, try this. And they're like, I'm like, does that work more? And they're like, no. And then they're like, I'm like, try this. No, try this. No, try this. And they're like, that's worse. I hate that. But I will stumble upon it. Eventually I'm like, okay, try this. And then they're like, oh my God, I feel so much glute this way. You're a genius. And I think I failed like 8 times and then got it the ninth. But I have this bag of tricks I try with,
Hmm.
you know, whether they do hinge or scoop, foot position, foot stance width, how far or close your feet are.
Yeah.
You can always throw a band on, and then that's kind of one way to, with any exercise, throw a glute loop or hip circle on, and you're going to feel more glute that way. But think about every exercise. When I first started reading about bodybuilding when I was like 15 years old, one of the main things with like I always read about was I don't feel bench press in my pecs that much. And these bodybuilders would be like, you have to learn how to bench like a bodybuilder. You have to learn. And it's funny because you and I have powerlifting backgrounds too. And I think it's safe for the shoulders. So I teach people to bench like a powerlifter, you know, uh,
Actually, way better. Yeah.
not quite as wide. Don't go elbows straight out, kind of go elbows
Yeah.
more.
You're really using your back a lot. People don't realize that when like you're doing a powerlifting bench, you're actually using your back a lot, like just as like a more like a stabilizer. Like you're not like rowing, of course, but it's a
But
lot more. Yeah, it's a lot more engagement than you would think. So the one thing so I wanted to cover setup because you talked about, okay, some people don't feel it, or maybe people are just doing something not right, because you see all types of form. And now again, caveat, as you've heard Bret say, like there's not one perfect way to do it, because the way that one person feels, it might be a little bit different, but there are certain things that are like, all right, these are general recommendations that pretty much work for everybody. So like bench height, where you're looking, like all those things. So let's go down kind of like the basics of like what to do.
Okay, so bench height ideally is around 14 inches for most people. If you're really short, or you're like Lane Norton and you're all legs and no torso, it's funny. He has to use like a 12-inch. My hip thruster is too short for him. He has to like crawl up because his legs are, he says, proportionally such long legs. Um, you have to, so 12 inches for shorter or long-legged, relatively long-legged people, but 14 inches for most. And then you'll see like NBA players using my hip thruster. It's hilarious. And their tibias are taller than the bench. So they're actually at the top, they lock out, they're slanted downwards. Um, so that they would probably ideally want like 16 inches for guys that are like six, I don't know, 10 and above or something. But anyway, for most people, 14 inches,
Yeah.
that comes to 35.5 centimeters. That's ideal. All right. If you're using a taller bench, that's okay. You just have to scoot up. You kind of crawl up it, walk your way up it with your scapulae. Um, and then you wouldn't touch down on the floor in between reps. You'd use constant tension reverse in midair if you're using a taller bench. But let's say you are using a 14-inch bench or like an aerobic step with, I think, like say 4 or 5 risers. I think 5 risers come to that 35.5 centimeter, 14-inch spot. You're backed up to it, so you're as high up as you can be. Now, some of my girls will sit on an Eric's pad to help them prop them up higher, but some of them don't. If they're taller, they don't. Now, you want the bench resting at lower scapular level. We used to do it where the bench would rest at the upper back, like the upper scapula. Now we do it where the bench rests at the lower scapula. It tends to just lead to better form. From there, you bring your legs back and you want to drag your legs back such that, and put your feet in position such that when you lock it out, the shins are vertical. You have right angles at the knees. So if your feet are too far away, you'll feel it more in your hamstrings. If they're too close, you'll feel it more in your quads. So you want the perfect foot distance to make it vertical shins at lockout. So let's say you're all set up, you're ready, then you take a deep breath, brace, then you know lift the you elevate you start raising the hips, and from there there's 2 ways to do it. There's the hinge and there's the scoop. Approximately 2/3 of people prefer the scoop method, 1/3 prefer the hinge method. The scoop method is the posterior pelvic tilt method, and this came about because some people hurt their backs when they hip thrust because they hyperextend their lumbar spine. The scoop method completely prevents that. So what you do is you keep your gaze forward, you keep looking straight ahead, you move from the sternum down so your body kind of curls up, and then at the top you end up locking it out into a strong posterior pelvic tilt. Your rib cage is down. That about 2/3 of people prefer that way. I've heard some people say that that's dangerous because your posterior pelvic tilt is dangerous for the spine. I've never had anyone hurt themselves in all my years of training people this way. But it can't, the research applying to like lumbar flexion doesn't apply here because you don't have the compressive forces on the spine, not because you're not vertically loaded. It's funny, people have this misunderstanding. They think when you do a squat, it's the bar on your back that's compressing the spine down. The bar only, even if you have some of the strongest squatters and they have 1,000 pounds on their back, the compressive load on the spine is more like 10,000 pounds. Like, one study showed 40,000 Newtons, and that's not even, today's people are stronger. We're looking at probably 60,000 now with the strongest people, maybe 15,000 pounds of compressive force on the spine. Where does that come from if the bar only weighs 1,000? It's from the muscular contractions around the core that clamp down. When you squeeze a muscle so hard, it compresses. So if the discs, if you got a muscle that spans from the pelvis to the rib cage, then it will compress the discs. So the erectors are probably the primary, and like abs, obliques, erectors. Erectors are probably one of the main muscles. Like in a squat and deadlift, it's the main muscle that produces compressive force. But when you posterior pelvic tilt, think about it. The erectors lengthen; they're shut off. They're not going to produce compressive force, and you're not using the abs to posterior tilt. You're using the glutes, so it's very safe. You don't have compressive forces. The posterior pelvic tilt and associated lumbar flexion, God, I'm getting really technical, sorry, is not dangerous. So that's the one method. The other method is the hinge method. And that's where you just try to keep your torso, head, and neck in line. Your torso, head, and neck are one unit. You start out looking forward. You rise up, keeping your everything in neutral. And then at the top, you're looking up. You don't stay looking forward like the scoop method. You're looking up. Some people like the hinge method more, about 1/3 of people. I like it with a wider stance. I don't know why. I put those two things together. You don't have to, but I like both methods. And with the hinge method, because you're not posterior tilting, you end up pushing the bar taller. So you tend to have to use a little bit lighter load, but it's hard because you're using more barbell displacement, more barbell range of motion. So those are the two ways. The things I look for: don't come up on, don't lift the heels off the ground. Don't rise up onto the toes. Push through the heels. Um, shins vertical. Did you reach full lockout? Don't scoot back on the bench. Like as you come up, don't slide backward on the bench. Stay put. And there's a couple of things I've learned with the strong lifting competition. We do the hinge method in competition mostly because if you allow posterior pelvic tilting with a really heavy weight, what happens? People get up, they get like 3/4 the way up and they can't get it. So then they will actually curl their spine downwards and do this masa. They'll do this premature posterior pelvic tilt to fake the lockout, and it's not a legit lockout. It's a pseudo lockout.
Red light.
And then also what people do is they come up and they'll scoot up on the bench, come up some more, or they'll come up and they have to move the bar forward in like 3 phases. So I try to make it one smooth lift. Those are the more advanced things that you do when you're trying to lift maximal loads. But one of the main things we always stress, I have from day one, if you watched all my videos, you always stress the lockout. I've said this from day one. From the very first video I ever made, I've said it all along. We've always done more pauses. We probably do more pauses than regular reps. Pause reps because you want the emphasis at the end range. You want to do normal reps and also pause reps. Where you pause for 1 second or 3 seconds. That's typically what we do at my gym. We also use bands. Now you can put a mini bender on the knees. That helps because I call that putting double duty on the booty. You're using the bar requires hip extension torque out of the glutes, but the bands require hip abduction torque out of the glutes. So you're putting double duty on the booty. They're getting worked as hip extensors and abductors at the same time. And then you can put a bander on the hips and just do band hip thrusts. And then you can also put glute loops around the barbell and attach them to, we do this with my hip thruster. And then it's harder at the top. So it really stresses the lockout. So those are some of our favorite methods. We do so many pause, we do pulses, a lot of pulses, especially with the glute loops. So that's one thing that we can always find a way to work the glutes well.
And I think it's just really important to really narrow down, there's not a lot of spine movement, you are moving, but you're kind of, it's just not a lot of, and the thing that's hard about this, and especially for people like who can go really easily into an anterior tilt, like myself and other people, when the bar is literally pushing you, like it's going to just push you back, especially if there's more weight, So for me, what I tend to do is like, before I even start, I just kind of have to force myself to go to neutral first, and then I go, because otherwise I'm just like pushed back, and now I'm in this like anterior tilt, and I can work through the range of motion, but it's not necessarily as effective. So for me, if you do struggle with that, what I just do is I just kind of go, before I even start the movement, all right, go to neutral, and then I can go. The one thing that I've always found, for me at least, and I've talked to you about this, and I just wanted to get, you to discuss this on the podcast, is some people do really well and they feel it in their glutes, feel it, right, with the heavy weight. And of course, there's always this debate, okay, well, do you have to feel a muscle for it to grow? And, because technically, if you're doing like a 1 or 2 rep max, if you're not really feeling stuff, it's just kind of like hard, right? Versus if you're doing a set of 10 or 15, you're going to feel that a lot more. But in general, there seems to be a distinct difference between people who like heavy hip thrusts and there's people who like lighter hip thrusts. I'm on the lighter side. I like I just tend to feel them a lot better. Like when I do them heavy, I just don't feel like I get a lot out of them versus heavy squats or deadlifts for me. So let's just touch on that really quick, because I know there's a lot of people who are kind of in either camp and are probably feeling like, well, what should I be doing? What's better? What's worse? Is there a better, or is it just kind of, again, down to you as a person?
So here's where my experience as a research as a scientist and a trainer kind of conflict a little bit, but I'm also biased because I like heavy lifting, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, I know, and this has been going on for ages. You see, I remember for as long back as videos have been around of us lifting, like when YouTube came out or when Instagram came out. And if I ever had someone do like a 3 rep max leg press, I'd get at least 3 dudes that were like, why? What's the point? They're bodybuilders who do higher reps.
Yeah.
So when they go heavy, they're not trained to go that heavy. They're kind of like, what's the point? A leg press isn't a, you know, and everyone's so biased with powerlifting. It's like, it's okay to do heavy squats and deads, but anything else is stupid. It's like, okay, well, why do heavy squats and deads? Why not always just do, why not do 10 to 20 reps of everything? It's safer, right? But it's fun to lift heavy.
Mhm.
Here's what I'll say as a trainer. You get some, newbie who's hasn't lifted weights before. They have zero confidence. They're so intimidated. And within 3 months, you work them up to a 225-pound hip thrust, and they're lifting 4 plates off the ground, locking it out. It's like getting your first chin up. They're like, oh my god, oh my! They're so excited. How can that not be a good thing? As a trainer, you want to convert lifelong lifters. Like you're trying to teach them, give them the gift of health for life. You don't want them just relying on you. They're gonna move on from you eventually. You want them to stay lifting for life. So there's a lot of reasons why I like heavy hip thrusts, but I agree. I measured the glute activation of increasingly heavier hip thrusts from 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of 1 rep max. The glute activation doesn't go up like you'd think. It's not like 50% of 1 rep max activates your glutes to 50% and 90% of 1 rep max activates your glutes to 90%. It's the first rep, of a 50 rep max hip thrust might activate your glutes to 50% of MBIC of maximum. And whereas you use 90% of 1 rep max, and the first rep might activate you to, say 65% of 1 rep max or something. And then you get the second, the third rep, and no matter what, if you go towards failure, you're getting high muscle activation towards the end. If you go to close to failure, so you would expect it to be a bigger. So for that reason, when I did that, I was like, okay, I think it's better to do. I think it is better to do higher rep hip thrust for muscle growth. But I still like a variety of rep ranges, even though the research doesn't quite support that. The research suggests that you can build your. I mean, it doesn't suggest. It's pretty clear at this point. There's like 30 studies now showing that you get equal muscle growth whether you're doing heavyweight or lighter weight. The muscle growth is around equal as long as you're pushing the sets hard.
Mhm.
And there's not much evidence for a variety being, because I've always been like, yeah, well, you want to do a little bit heavier weight to maybe maximally build the type 2 fibers, the lighter weight to maximally build the type 1 fibers. That's not, there's not a ton of evidence for that. There's a couple studies, like we published one. It wasn't significant. There was a trend, the effect sizes showed a trend for greater growth, but it wasn't significantly different. So, but I still, as a coach, I still prescribe that. Like, okay, that's why I like pyramids. Do a set of 15, do a set of 10, do a set of 5, then do a drop set, or not a drop set, a back off set of really light where you bust out a set of 20, constant tension so you get a really big pump, and then call it a day. That's one method, but there's so many ways to do things.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want people to understand, because I think sometimes people will see stuff, and goes for any lift, not just hip thrusting, but people will see something and be like, oh my God, why can't I hip thrust 800 pounds? Or why am I not squatting 300 pounds? And you're like, well, first of all, that's like a trained adaptation. Is that what you want to do? You know what I mean? And do you need to do that? Right? Like, do you want, like, is that something that you enjoy doing? Like, I personally, like, I enjoy training, but I don't really enjoy heavy lifting, like, personally. So for me, it's like, I'd much rather do reps. So I'm like, if I feel this better and I'm getting the same type of results, like, why wouldn't I do this? You know what I mean? Obviously, if I'm training for strength exclusively, that's not going to work, but I'm not. So it really doesn't matter. So,
Wait, last thing I want to say about that, though, that you know everyone's always all about like they're so black and white in our industry. The one thing that I will say is push when you have a goal, a lot of times, like, okay, when I turned 40 4 years ago, I was like, I'm gonna see results. I'm gonna have my best body at 40, you know? So my birthday's July. In July, January, I started pushing it. I had 6 months of training like a freaking crazed beast. And I trained, that's the hardest I've ever trained. Um, I had a goal. I was a man on a mission. Well, guess what? I did a lot of singles, a lot of doubles, a lot of triples. My body got better because I was on a mission.
Exactly.
Half of it doesn't, people all talk about rep ranges and rest times. It's more like how hard are you, how psyched up are you for to reach your goal? When we started training for the first strong lifting meet in October of 2020, my girls grew their glutes. They were used to doing like more reps. They started hammering heavy hip thrusts, but they were like pushing it so hard, their glutes grew during that time. I started noticing, I was like, whoa, you know, Ashley, your glutes look bigger. Carly, your glutes look bigger. Dom, your glutes look bigger. Amanda, I think your glutes have grown, and I started noticing that, and that's because they were training for a purpose. They were training so hard. So ultimately, no matter what rep range you train in, you got to utilize progressive overload. You have to figure out a way to put more attention on the glutes over time, and that's how they grow.
Yeah, I think people, you can't expect to just go fuck off at the gym and you're going to grow anything. You know what I mean? So you do have to have intention. You do need to have progression. But there's so many different ways to do it. And to wrap this up, I did want to touch on just a few variations. I know that we did say some of them before, but I think, it can be, you're like, oh, it's just a barbell hip thrust. It's like, no, there's so many different ways. And I will plug your book. It's really great at showing all the different exercises as well as so many different variations. But what are a few of your favorite variations with hip thrusts movement pattern that maybe people wouldn't think about?
Well, I like this is a pain in the butt to set up, but someone along the way came up with a single leg landmine hip thrust. You use the landmine to load the single leg hip thrust. You put the landmine up to the side. It's just a very stable, and it's really, yeah, those took off. So those are something you wouldn't think of.
That's super
Single
cool.
leg landmine hip thrust, but
Okay.
it's a pain in the butt to set up. Um, I love Smith machine hip thrusts. I like the ones on the slanted version better. And you line up, you set up to where that as the bar rises, it pushes out further. It doesn't come closer towards you. You do it that way. Um, I also like Smith machine frog pumps. I'd say
Yeah.
about 2/3 of people love frog pumps, 1/3 don't, but there are ways to feel more. I like the my favorite hip thrust is the bar plus band, uh, like bar plus glute loops. And then uh, I like those for like constant tension where you don't touch down. You just do the top half. They're pulses. We've been doing those for years. And sometimes I'll have people who come to my gym, and I know they want me to like surprise them and give them something they want their glutes to burn like crazy, and I'll have them do 3 sets of 20 with just one plate on each side, so 135 pounds, only 135 pounds on the bar, a glute loop, two glute loops from the bar to the hip thruster, and they just do the top half and they pause for 1 second at the top of each rep. 3 sets of 20 will crush anyone.
Yeah.
Um, and why? What are your favorites? What am I missing? I
I prefer
I can
the
tell you're itching to say your favorite.
no
What?
no no no. I love high rep and banded ones. Like that's my favorite for sure.
Banded around the knees or banded around the hips?
Banded around the hips. It is that's a pain for me to set up because I don't have a hip.
How do
I
you set
don't
up
have a
with?
hip. Yeah, like you can loop it around like if you have the right rack, you can do it. Obviously if you have a hip thruster, it's super easy, but I don't, so it's a little bit harder. But I would say that banded around the hips is my favorite. I do just love high rep regular hip thrust. I typically do more of the higher range too. Like sometimes I don't even let it touch at the bottom because again, I feel that better for that kind of high rep work. I personally, and I know we have so many clients who love um bridges, like barbell bridges, and I don't know, like some days I like them, some days I don't, so I'm kind of like weird about those. And single leg, I can never, I just can't ever really get single leg to work for me. So like, but again, some people love doing the single leg ones, so it's like you just have to kind of see what works for you. But I would say that for me, high rep barbell. I do love any of the machines too, like the glute drive or like the booty builder. I love both of those, to be
Yeah,
super honest. And first of all, it obviously just takes away the setup, so that's really nice.
yeah, yeah.
But I just like how it feels and like how that motion just works. So if you guys have access to any of those, I would highly recommend them. And then you can really easily play around with like the pauses and the rep ranges, and like you can do drops. Like it's just really easy because you don't have to take off the barbell, the whole thing. So I would say that favorites are like machine.
1 1/4 reps where you do come up all the way, come down a little bit, lock it out again, then
Yeah.
come all the way down. Single leg, Lauren, I've been given 3 sets, now with like COVID era, I keep talking about this. We have to figure out ways that they can train hard at home. So the 3 sets of 20 single leg, but with single leg, you don't do the posterior, you don't do the scoop method. You do the
Yeah.
hinge.
Okay.
You do the hinge method with single leg, and 3x20 is killing people.
Okay. Maybe I'll try the hinge because I'm probably still doing it the other way. I don't ever feel like I can lock it out fully. You know what I mean?
That
And
method for 3 sets of 20, it'll kill you.
okay.
My clients have a love-hate relationship with it, but um and yeah, you brought up something else that I wanted to talk about and I just forgot it. But there's not one way for everyone. Everyone's got to experiment to figure out, just like squats and deads, you have to figure out your best way. And also, oh, that's what I want. Some days you get a pump better than others. It's the same thing for delts. I love the days I get the craziest delt pump. Some days it's just not there. It's you can't get a sick pump every single day.
No, and that would be great. And obviously we try to do things we maximize with, nutrition and meal timing and all these kinds of things, but it's like sometimes it's just not happening that day. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. And sometimes you just have to do stuff and be like, I don't maybe feel this great right now, but I still am making progress. So there's that too. You do need to have variation in there. So I still do glute bridges, even though they're not my favorite, but I'll still do them every once in a while for a few weeks. And then there's still some kind of variation there. So
I joke, and I know we're probably went way over, but I joke around with my strongest clients, like my client Carly, we were just talking about this, and my client Kiana, she's got some of the greatest glutes, and we always joke around that we love an exercise for like a month until we use progressive overload to the point where we hate it and we don't feel it as much anymore, and then we switch, and
yeah,
then you got to come back and find it again. You're like, oh, I haven't done these, well, I love them now.
exactly.
And then you keep trying to go up and up and up, and then you hate it again, and then
It's the never-ending cycle of being a meathead. So for the next podcast, we're going to do a Q&A. I think you guys are really going to enjoy that. I took some of the most frequently asked questions and put them together for you guys. But before we end this, where can the listeners find either your book or some of the products? You're talking about the glute loops, and you can also get hip thruster pads, etc. So where is the best place to find all that?
you just go to my Instagram, and it's the link at Instagram, the link tree or whatever, that link takes you to everything. So that's the best place.
Perfect. And what is your Instagram?
At Bret Contreras 1.
Okay.
This poor Bret Contreras guy, he's like barely posted, but yeah, he's probably like.
I always wondered why there was a 1, and I was like, there had to be something.
He posted like 4 times or something, and I'm like, I wish I could just. I've tried contacting you, like, can I buy this from you? But he doesn't reply.
Yeah. I had that for our website. There was some version of the website I was trying to buy, and it was like some running website that never used it. They had like one picture on there. I was like, oh my God, seriously? Like, this is what has the name? Come on. But anyways, thank you guys so much for listening. Be sure to check out teamlocofit.com to apply for coaching, check out the other podcasts, and read any articles that we've written. And we will catch you guys on Wednesday for our part 2 Q&A.